And good afternoon and welcome to a live event at the Cape Town Press Club. Just want to acknowledge that we have the Honorary Consul of Vanuatu, the Consul General of Switzerland, the Consul General of India, and the Foreign Service Officer of the United States of America. A welcome also to our new members, Kevin Brigg and Pat Stradon, who are both here today, and also to Leonard Hirsch and Debbie Shabberson. And thank you, of course, to the sponsor, Distell, for the wines that you are enjoying. I just want to remind you that we don't want to become a super spreader event, so if you move between tables, please put on your mask, and we'd prefer it if you stayed in your place. Thank you. Upcoming functions. On the 13th of April, we have Alan Wind and Cameron Dugmore here at the ballroom, who are going to debate whether greater powers should be devolved to the provinces. But today, I'm very happy to welcome our speaker, Tony Leon, founder of the Democratic Party and Democratic Alliance, former leader of the official opposition, who served for 20 years in Parliament, first taking Helen Suzman's seat when she retired, and then leading the Democratic Party to become the longest-serving leader of the official opposition since democracy. President Jacob Zuma then appointed him ambassador to Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, and I visited him there, and we did an interview for the Mail and Guardian. He's just written a new book, penned during the coronavirus lockdown, Future Tense, examining the country's response, the economy, the rise of Julius Malema, provides lots of insider views, and first time gives an account of power struggles inside the Democratic Alliance, and which saw the exit of the first black leadership in 2019. The book is available. It's at the back there from Exclusive Books. I think it's 282 Rand. And apparently you can also use your Fanatics cards if you have them with you to get discount. So please welcome Tony Leon.
Well, thank you very much, Brent, for that very warm introduction. He himself has authored a book recently, which I have on my shelf, unread, but that's mainly because I'm working for Jonathan Paul in Exclusive Books at the moment, promoting my book. That's what happens when you write a book. We publish in the book seller does well, but I'm delighted to do so because I do have some thoughts about where we are and where we're going. And I need to say, just a commercial break before we start, about Future Tense Reflections on My Troubled Land. Every home should have one, or two, or three, and I'll be available outside to sign if you wish me to do that. You'll be able to sell it on eBay at a discount once I've signed it, you see. And then, thank you very much for extending the invitation to me today. I need to tell you, I was so excited, I put on a suit for the first time in 1 year, reminding myself that actually it's just about a year since we were locked down. And that, of course, birthed my book because it kept me sane. I called it my afternoon project, do something. I didn't want to do it at first, and Jonathan Ball, very sadly, who is now extremely ill, prevailed upon me to do so, and I really did require a lot of thought and research and work, but I'm pleased I went through that because it allowed me to clarify and do it hopefully in a reasonably concise and accessible way. And on the subject of my dear friend Jonathan Ball, who published 3 of my 4 books, 4 of my 5, I've got to lose count. When I wrote my big fat book, it's on the top of Brent's pile, On the Contrary, Jonathan took me out, he always did things over libation or 5 at the Mount Nelson Hotel. And he said, Tony, I'm not afraid of a big book. Tell the whole story. So every time we'd have another lunch, another drink, he said, oh, you tangled with Winnie Mandela, we must have a chapter on her. He said, you witnessed the degradation of Parliament, let's have a chapter. And this thing got elephantitis, the book. And eventually it weighed in at 707 pages with all these editions. Fact checked by Jan Hubert, so he bears all the responsibility for errors. And this book was a very different order, although commissioned by the same man, the same publishing house, Jonathan Ball, because they said, do you want a permissive editor or a merciless editor? I said merciless. So I was then introduced to the absolutely rigorous Tracy Hawthorne, resident in Riebeck, Castile. There's not only one writer who lives in Riebeck, Castile. And the result was 25,000 words disappeared off the book that's hopefully going to be in everyone's hands before you leave here. So, in fact, Brent, you kindly mentioned you lock the doors until everyone actually buys my book. No, I just need to understand the terms of trade, as they say. So this book is reasonably concise and hopefully accessible. And what I tried to do was to, having been old enough and ugly enough to have been in the room, or several rooms, at some critical moments, you know, to use that cliche when the door to the future, you know, turned on the hinges of history, etc. I thought, why did we land up here? What caused this to happen? And where are we now and where are we going? And, you know, look, I don't want to be entirely negative. The last 5 pages of 270 are actually positive. First 265 are probably realistic, but you know, we've got to pocket the wins and the victories that we get. So it was a win yesterday, or at least half a win, when Parliament, by a significant majority, voted to at least advance the impeachment process against our maladroit, malign and utterly malicious public protector. And that it was initiated by the DA and the ANC, you know, what you might say, very reluctantly went along and voted for it, is another win. And that this utterly pernicious public protector might be, someone put to the first Chapter 9 statutory body chairperson to be removed from office is probably a very good thing. So these are important things, and we celebrate them. Less to celebrate is something else that might be of concern, since we all sit in the demographic here. I don't want to insult anyone, probably largely one or two exceptions, the over 60 demographic. One or two of you might be even older than that. My former chief of staff, who's now the MEC for Finance, Mr. David Mania, announced in the Western Cape legislature yesterday, he said, we're in a fight between the virus and the vaccine, and the problem is that the virus is winning. So I went and looked at the figures thoughtfully provided by the chap who launched my book last week on Zoom. Every home should view it as well. Valdemar Pelser's heads of report. And these figures are quite staggering. Yesterday in South Africa, 953 people were vaccinated only. On the same day in Russia, we love the Russians, don't like the Americans so much, 149,000 people were vaccinated. And in the, big Satan back in the US, 2.4 million people were vaccinated. And then the other figure that really is shameful, I don't want to give you indigestion, is that Rwanda vaccinated 140,000 people in 2 days, and South Africa's managed to vaccinate 140,000 people in 3 weeks. That's Rwanda. Not a first world European or American country. And our health minister, whom in its credulity the Financial Mail put on its cover as the man of the year last year, well, he was, because he was asleep at the switch when vaccines were being procured, and did nothing until the 16th of January this year, when there was an absolute circulation of a devastating media by some of the most impressive epidemiologists and immunologists in this country. And then suddenly, behind hidden hand and dragging foot, some things were put in place. Now, in 1977, when I was in my first year of Bachelor of Arts at Wits University, which also gets a look in this book, and I was even more precocious then. I don't think you can be precocious at 64, but I was very precocious when I was 20. Amazing, I know, for you to imagine that. I was the chairman of the Young Progressives in Johannesburg, which was the youth wing of the PFP, which became eventually, through various mutations, additions, divisions, and all the other ghastly things that are described in my book in front of you, the DA of today. And we organized a conference at the President Hotel. Those of you with a certain memory of Johannesburg, there was once a President Hotel, and there was once a CBD that actually was quite nice, although you put that in the bin, literally. And it was, you know, where do you stand, South Africa? And we had this very charismatic bishop came to address us called Desmond Tutu. And Tutu said something then in 1977 that I've never forgotten. He said, you know something about Parliament, which of course was entirely white in 1977 until 1994. It's a great thing there are black people in South Africa. Because if there weren't black people in South Africa, the white parliamentarians would have nothing to talk about. And one of these sub-themes running through my book, not just because I'm married to a country woman, is Israel. And not because of, you know, the fact that I happen to be Jewish. You can't say that in the Kelvin Grove these days, I understand. Sorry, no, I do. It's a rather poor joke. But it is, and Israel is a brilliant example of how this country shoots itself in the foot. No, not that Israel, we talking about being Jewish and married, we in that tiny universe of Israelis or Jews who actually can't stand Bibi Netanyahu and the Likud government. It makes us about 0.5% of the South African Jewish population, but anyway. So the thing is this, and one of the anecdotes and stories I tell, there's very tragic stories. When Cape Town was experiencing Day Zero, the then Israeli ambassador, and in fact Yanyan provided the figures, it was the worst year of drought in this country since records were first kept. I mean, we were at the real blunt end of that, as you well know, from those dim and distant days. You know, no water, we were going to run out, taps were going to run dry. So the very engaged Israeli ambassador, Arthur Leng, came to Cape Town, and he had an Israeli water week. And they offered South African government at all its levels Israel water technologies, which were absolutely life-changing in every respect. And all they got from Mr. Faiz Jacobs, who got on as an ANC secretary in the high turnover job in the Western Cape, incidentally, since they lose their secretaries almost as often as they lose elections here. But he said, we will have nothing to do with this. And the DA government's been captured by Israeli lobbyists. I wish the DA government of Western Cape be captured by a few vaccine companies, but that's another story. I'd rather think that they could use their provincial power to better effect and get us all vaccinated, Alan and David. I hope you're listening, as I've tried to tell. Push the envelope, bring for your own people what the government doesn't provide you. And the thing was, so we spurned Israel on its water technology. Instead of which, as I report, the Minister of Water, that well-known good governance practitioner, what was her name? The one who got the Aston Martin. No, the then Minister of Water. She got the Aston Martin for 3.5 million rand through some deal with some Eskom provider. Makanyana. Yeah, that's her. Makanyana. And she went to Iran to sign a water cooperation deal. Iran, which has a terrible record of desalination, even to the extent Iranians can talk about it, it has been highly criticized within Iran, but that's where we went to get, and nothing has been heard further of the deal since then. And now, as someone was saying, the water levels in the Eastern Cape dams are now 15%. So what happened in the Western Cape is now going to happen in the Eastern Cape. Except there's no good government to go and save the good folk of the Eastern Cape. They change the names, they don't change the government in the Eastern Cape. And maybe there's a lesson in that as well. So that's a challenge. And interesting enough, one of the 25,000 words that were chucked out of this book by my stringent editor and publisher were a few paragraphs on vaccinations. And I said, well, you know, because we were redoing this in January, and I said, well, we haven't got a vaccination plan. I said, well, look, this movie keeps changing. And that's quite true. And you can't, in all good conscience and with any kind of intellectual cohesion, say to the government, what you did last March was wrong. Because actually, nobody, not here, certainly not Boris Johnson in the UK, least of all Donald Trump in the US, actually knew what the consequences of this new pathogen that had arrived, which is essentially 10,000 times smaller than a grain of sand. It's a tiny fleck of RNA that floats about, and, does these devastating things to us. So you couldn't be sure that what you did was the right thing, or what you didn't do was the wrong thing, because it was imperfect. But the point that I make in future tense, Reflections on My Troubled Land, is that practically every decision that happened since the lockdown and into the future predated this extraordinary novel plague that's upon us by years, if not decades, and some of the personalities as well. And what happened in South Africa last year, what's happening this year, is that as we are in the fight of our lives, and I mean that literally and metaphorically as well, we are disabled because of decisions that were made and decisions that weren't made at critical moments, and choices that were averted and others that weren't made. So that is, that's some of the book, but I hope it's written in a reasonably humorous and accessible way, but you can judge for yourself. So I don't know if he's a hero of my book. I mean, he's very good at cooking pilchards and Mahuba's kloof, but someone I always got on very well with is my old sparring partner, Titus Mboweni, now the Minister of Finance. In fact, my last book, Opposite Mandela, he launched for me in Johannesburg. And, strange enough, although he's had a few eruptions on Twitter, which seems to be his favourite means of communication, he was extraordinarily non-racial. So the DP had so few MPs in 1994 when I was its leader, it wasn't much of a job then, that I had to also be the Labour spokesman because there were only two lawyers in our whole caucus, grand total of 7 people in our caucus then, and so I had to do Labour and be the leader and do a few other things in between. And the Minister of Labour was Tito Mboweni, so we got to know each other quite well. And we'd had these ferocious fights about the Labour Relations Act, which I opposed, the Employment Equity Act, which I opposed, all other pieces of what I call pernicious social engineering, which didn't endear me to members of the press at the time. We thought we were involved in some grand new crusade, and we were, but we were also building a scaffold which would come to execute the economic prospects of this country going forward, as we have done with some of that legislation. Anyway, Tito was, he didn't resort to name calling or racism. He was, he could take an argument, invite you out for a drink. He was a joined up human being, mature. Now, Tito's called back to the colours out of his very comfy, cosy and lucrative retirement to go and be the Minister of Finance. And one of the non-heroes of my book is Thabo Mbeki, whom I had the misfortune of opposing, a man who didn't brook any opposition, internal or external, but his brother Maletsi does better under my pen. But the interesting thing is that Thabo Mbeki, who I give credit where credit's due and discredit also where it's utterly deserved, at least backed his own Minister of Finance. So while Trevor Manuel gets a lot of laurels for doing the right thing when he was Minister of Finance, it would have been impossible if the President of the day hadn't given him the political cover to do what he did. So that when Manuel and Mbeki exited the Finance Ministry and the Presidency respectively, South Africa was borrowing at a rate of about 22% of its GDP. Extraordinary good levels. We now are hurtling over the cliff towards 100% of our GDP. And just to give you one of the examples, so I said you can write a narrative like I've written with a fair confidence that what you're describing didn't just commence from a standing start, it started a long while back and it's just been added to. But the one thing on the facts and the figures is when I started toying around the book at the end of 2019, the government was borrowing 1 billion rand a day on the bond market to fund its expenditure. A year later, when we were putting the finishing touches to this book at the end of 2020, it was borrowing 2 billion rand a day. And one of the constituency I addressed, and they're absolutely worth it in terms of votes because they give you all of 4 seats in Parliament, are that tiny band of South African taxpayers, 125,000 of them, who pay the biggest slice of personal income tax in this country, which translates to the fact that 4% of the tax base pays 50% of all taxes. And the other phenomenon on that very fragile base, which is, dying, with great respect, emigrating, and deeply uncertain about its future, and I try and address some of those future concerns, is where does that money go? And I'm not talking about the trillion rand lost to corruption, that's a big slice of it. But actually just on a back of the envelope calculation of every rand in the government's current budget, 20 cents of every rand spent by the government is paying that interest bill. 41 cents is spent on paying those public servants' wages. Now back to, so that's 61 cents before you start accounting. Now back to my old friend, Mr. Titi Mboweni, Minister of Finance. He gave a pretty good budget last week, or sorry, 2 weeks ago. And he said, we are going to freeze the public sector wage bill because Tito, unlike Jacob Zuma or Malusi Gigabi, can actually read figures and understand them and also understand the writings on the wall, and it's not addressed to someone else. So he said, we're going to freeze it for 3 years and stabilize our debt and spending. And as Carol Payton pointed out just yesterday in the Business Day, Tito's budget survived all of 3 weeks after its contact with reality. Not on the public sector wages, which forget about reading, that's going to help, but on the fees must fall student protests. You know, the noisiest or squeakiest wheel always gets the most attention. So students start protesting, writing. One was tragically, or non-student actually, was killed outside. That's even worse. It tells you a lot about our policing, but that's another matter. And what happens is that within a week of that, the government says, okay, we found 18 billion rand to go and prop up the National Student Finance Scheme. And then, as Carol pointed out in an article yesterday, here's the thing in South Africa. The government, with your money, spends at the moment, due to various costly promises Jacob Zuma made on the way to the exit door, which this government still seems it has to honour for reasons I don't quite understand. The government spends 115 billion rand a year on higher education. By contrast, where really, if you want to address the future of South Africa, it's not at the universities, that helps. It's in early childhood development, which is absolutely critical. Ask any educationalist. They only spend 1 billion rand. So the cynics among you, and I know there are no cynics in the Cape Town Press Club, but if you were of a cynical, you might say, why 115 billion rand for students and 1 billion rand for early childhood? Well, 2 examples. Students have votes, and 5-year-olds don't make noise, but they don't go and protest at key intersections where the government and the media is. So that's a very cynical interpretation of one of the many distortions and illogicalities in South Africa. Dan, it goes to the question of choices. You've got finite resources, you've got extremely hard-pressed taxpayers, you've got repressed consumers, you've got to make some tough choices. So when Tito said 3 weeks ago, this is our budget, 3 weeks later, they've already added 18 billion. You remember last September, 10 billion for South African Airways. And if you think, ladies and gentlemen, that they're going to stick to their no pay increase for Silver Zone the next 3 years, as the great Tony Soprano said, forget about it. Ain't going to happen. Because the president is missing in action when it comes to backing up his finance minister. And I point out in the book, when I looked at the imposition of what I call COVID economics, that in every critical interaction at the level of the state, we had a situation where Tito Mboweni, as Minister of Finance and National Treasury, lost every round to those that I call the economic Talibans in the government. So, if you take another item that postdates my book, but it's all dealt with, at least the how we got there, issue of police and crime might be of some concern to folks here. You might have seen that my friend Audrey Russell knows a lot about this, and she's fascinated by forensic pathology, that the South African Police Service lost 8 million items of forensic evidence. and from crime scenes, and mainly they didn't actually use it, I mean, they didn't throw it away, because the computer service provider wasn't paid, so at some point it just disappeared off the database, it hadn't been entered. These that got entered. Mr. Becky Kelly said that as of the 2nd of March, this month, there was a backlog of 172,000 cases at the National South African Police Crime Laboratories. 172,000, that's a backlog. And he said, oh, I only became aware of it very recently. He said the issues in the what he calls the procurement supply chain management. That's a euphemism, incidentally, for corruption. That's what happened, among other things. And you might indicate when the post office last delivered you a letter or a magazine. You said, don't come to Constantia anymore. I don't know what they have against us there. And you saw that Denel, is in hock to about 4 billion, and there's a terrible list. And so we're in a bizarre situation, where, to quote another hero in my book, Mr. Rushi Sharma, he of Morgan Stanley Global Analysis, we are a country, as he described it, of maximum government and minimum governance. Very brilliant phrase. So you have, the state wants to control everything, that's its ideology, but it can't govern anything. So you have this fantastic disconnect. Okay, so that's the bad news. The good news, the last 4 pages of the book. My stepson Itai, who I quote with approval, said to me that my problem is I was far too state-centric in my analysis. He said, if you look only at the government, it's an absolute horror show. So you look outside the government and the state, there's some good and great things happening. Now, in a previous address here, I would have said the judiciary is a great thing. I'm afraid not. Going back to the Israel obsession, you'll notice Mogoeng gets brought before the firing squad on his Israel mocks, which I thought were very over the top for the Chief Justice or any judge, but amazing. He made the most incendiary anti-vaccination comments, and he doesn't even get a reprimand. Israel, that's the ultimate capital offense. And extraordinarily, John Schlorpy, the disastrous judge president in the Western Cape, absolute disaster, absolute havoc has happened in one of the most admired benches in this country. 10, 12 years since he was accused of suborning 2 Constitutional Court judges to bring a government judgment favourable to Zuma, and we don't know if it's who it is. The Acting Director General of Intelligence in South Africa, Mr. Jafta, together with the former Minister, Sidney Mufamadi, 2 years ago, gave Cyril Ramaphosa a report that said millions of rands of state, therefore tax money, was used and ferried by one of the current deputy ministers, the ex-minister, still in the cabinet, to go and pay bribes to judges to give judgments favourable to Zuma. I mean, if this is not a full frontal assault on the constitutional order that Cyril Ramaphosa himself gets most of the credit for birthing because he was the chief ANC negotiator, then I don't know what is. But nothing happens. It's all left to the millions of pages of evidence that Zondo might or might not one day make a determination on. And yet this is probably the most serious assault on the Constitution since 1994. So there's a lot of stuff, and a lot of it's very bad. On the other hand, Michal and I went to Rebecca Castile the other day to see my editor and have lunch, and it's very nice. I never met her, just over the computer. And we spent the weekend at this marvellous place, extraordinary for those of you who haven't been there. As you know, Rebecca West, Rebecca Castile, they're next to each other. The 2 most significant figures in the first 50 years of white politics were both born in this little dorpy in the Swartland. Anyway, as we were driving through, Michal said to me, and all right through the Swartland and all these fantastic wines, you know, the Cape Crusaders, the Sardis and the Badenhorst, these amazing world-achieving wines. You see the depth of the agri-industry. You see these huge silos. You see these fantastic wine farms, including the D.F. Milan family wine farm, Alles Verloren. And I was driving past Alles Verloren, and she was saying, you know, but look at the depth of this country. Look, these people aren't going anywhere. Look what they've built. And I thought, well, actually, the Milan wine farm is misnamed. It's not Alles Verloren. There is hope. there is depth. There are good people. There are civil organisations, the Cape Town Press Club being one of them. There are many. The last section of my book, I borrowed with acknowledgement the phrase of George H.W. Bush in 1988, 1,000 points of light in a broad and peaceful sky. Now we're going to need those points of light because Eskom's got load shedding for the next 5 years. It's about 5 years before, and 5 years before that, and no doubt 5 years to come. But there is a big dynamic in this country. And very often, because we lose faith and we lose the will, we don't actually see it happen. But it is alongside all the terrible, bad things that we must acknowledge, own up about, and deal with. It's also there. And our job as South African citizens, only office that I have to claim these days, citizen of South Africa, never mind all the ex-office I once held, is to keep that light shining bright. Thank you.
Right, we're going to open the floor up for questions. We have a roving mic which will come to you. Can I see hands, please? Any questions? At the back there. Do you want to do it one by one?
Yeah, well, let's do one by one because it just, my age is off forgetting after two.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Neil Kish from Kenilworth. I really enjoyed seeing it just happening. Just read your book as well. So
thank you.
Anybody who hasn't read the book, I'll make a recommendation.
Excellent, Neil. Please keep going.
Okay. That's what I have to say. Just wanted your thoughts on. It seems to be coming out of the Zondo Commission that part of this grand larceny that we've had in the country, the major beneficiaries seem to be the ANC party itself. And I just wanted your thoughts on that, because it doesn't seem to be widely acknowledged that this whole thing, as if individuals are stealing, but a lot of this money has gone to the ANC as a party. And what are the legal implications of all that?
Oh, you're absolutely correct. Look, I do hope this new Finance Act, I'm very skeptical. People get excited about the wrong things. They say, oh, disclosure, 100,000 rand, you've got to disclose your donors. Believe me, the next thing coming out is going to be something called bundlers, like they do in America. So suddenly you'll find increments of 99,000 rand being given by 50 people. So they'll just line up a lot of employees and they'll each give 99,000 rand in them. But anyway, it's at least a vague step towards transparency. The one thing you must not blame on Jacob Zuma, heaven knows you can blame a lot of things, is that somehow he birthed, and you're quite right, this idea that the SOEs, that's where it comes from, would be used as sluice gates for irrigating the ANC waters with money. Let me tell you, it started a long time ago. It started with Mandela. It gathered pace with Thabo Mbeki. And, the template was made. And, I deal with it in my book, incidentally. Just one example that I was the personal victim of, political victim of. In the 2004 difficult election campaign with the DA, we managed to scrape together, usually with bank loans and a few rich folk in South Africa who were prepared to back us, 25 million rand. The ANC spent 300 million rand that campaign. They literally, the chap called Majila stole 15 million rand out of Petro SA, now barely functioning, and he paid it over. There's a complicated way it was done. Basically, the money was taken out of a state-owned company, paid into the ANC, indirectly. And it was so blatant and became apparent, and thanks to newspapers like the Mail and Guardian, that I immediately took the case, because I was rather, as I say, we were at the receiving end of that money, if you were standing against the ANC, and I took it to the public protector. Problem was, the public protector had been appointed by Mbeki. I think this one is bad. He wasn't as bad as this one. Was Lawrence Mshwana, who in his previous life, how's this for independence, had been the chairman of the NCOP, the Upper House of Parliament, on nomination of the ANC, which is a member. So he found no fault. He found no one guilty. Ultimately, a court held both against him and the guilty parties, and nothing has happened. In the great South African tradition, ANC means absolutely no consequences. But that started a long time ago. And one of the reasons for this obsession, it's not the only one, about the state-owned companies is they provide funding to the ANC. Now, it might be that if Ramaphosa is sincere and about his determination to clean up, that might become less of a feature. But you've only got to look at the fact that you've got this Hitachi deal for Madupi and Kasira, which are the two worst decisions ever made in this country. That the ANC's so-called investment arm, Chancellor House, was one of the major beneficiaries of that deal. So it's continued. Whether it will continue, I don't know.
Right. I've got Yanya Nubert.
Thank you. Firstly, congratulations on your book, which I've started reading, and it's as wonderful a book as your speech has been. But two things, just arising from the previous question, you would be aware that there is a case pending which was started at the Cape Town Central Police Station by Grinus Breitenbach, not unknown to this club, to declare the ANC a criminal organisation. Do you think she has any chance of success? Have you had a look at that? And then secondly, sir, should we stay or should we go?
I've got a chapter on that called Fight or Flight, but no one will buy the book if I give them the answer, so that you can read about in the book. It's an intriguing thing. Look, as long as John Schlorp is a Judge Preston, that case is going nowhere, and he'll make sure the right judge will appoint together. I don't know how much of that is a serious thing. It's very difficult to prove in law, unless you really are in receipts of the known proceeds of a crime. And I think a much greater latitude Janjan's given to political parties than to, various gangs on the Cape Flats, for example. But so I don't know how serious that is or how publicity oriented it is. But I mean, there are crimes that happen every day, and it's once again the extraordinary thing about the ANC, and this to me is one of life's enduring mysteries, is they don't hide their intentions under some bushel somewhere. It's all in plain sight. So Ace Magashule, Mr. Good Governance himself from the Free State, Ace Magashule said, it was extraordinary the other day, or a few weeks ago, name me one person in the ANC National Executive who doesn't do business with the state. And as the Financial Mail said in response to that, that's out and out corruption. Because believe me, you are not hiring Ms. Basabili Dlamini for her business smarts. And you aren't getting Mr. Gigaba for his power, with Excel or his ability to read a balance sheet. You're getting them because they have connectivity. But then so much of South Africa and so much of our business is corroded by know-who becoming primary over know-how. And quite a lot of our decline is because of that fact. But yeah, it's clear in future danger.
Janjan's second question, stay or go?
Oh no, I said you've got to read the book to get the answer to whether you should stay or go, otherwise no one will read it. So, it's inside the covers somewhere, towards the end.
Over here.
Tony, thanks. With you having been in South America, I'm very keen to know or at least how many people you know in Venezuela, because we need people from Venezuela here, because my question regards expropriation without compensation. And this coming expropriation bill, where we have parliamentary hearings on it next week, how do we get people from Venezuela and other countries here to come and tell the story about this increasing nationalization of land, of assets, of property, and how do we derail, literally the word, derail, this coming onslaught on property rights?
Yeah, it's a huge problem also. And the unforgivable thing in all this, and we must keep fighting it, and there will be court. Look, you see, I think what's going to happen, this is a terrible piece of legislation, and I think it's going to be adopted in some form, and then they're going to be very cheery about implementing it. That's why Ramaphosa is president. Mr. Magashule and Mr. EFF, Malema, if they get into power, well, then that will be implemented with its full force. So I suppose Cyril is the least worst alternative, but what really depressed me, and I deal with it, Cyril and I, and many others, there were 400 people, but we were led our respective delegations, were very involved in the finalisation of the 1996 Constitution. And there was a celebratory function just up the road at Fernwood, a few days after we'd affirmed the Constitution in May 1996, and Cyril made a speech there, very emollient. I described Cyril as being like a lousy GP. He's got a terrible diagnosis, he's got a wonderful bedside manner, so you feel much more reassured when you hear his dulcet tones. Even the diagnosis is all wrong. But Cyril said something then that was quite believable. I mean, he was the chief architect. He said, look, this Constitution, which contained Section 25, which was a watered-down version of the original 93, but was better than what was on offer. My dear beloved colleague of blessed memory, Dean Smuts, chronicles that in her book, Parasites and Patriots. But what happened at that Fernwood function is Cyril stood up and said, this Constitution, it isn't the property of any one party, it's the product of all parties. He said, this is our country's birth certificate. Birth certificate. Now, as I call, unabridged or otherwise, birth certificates are unalterable in the main. Now, under the same Cyril Ramaphosa as president, it's a sort of driving license. You'll take it away if I don't like what the driver does. And they're now taking away, the white folks' driving license by saying, come after your property. Well, that's how it appears to be, property owners. And that's very dangerous. But the same guy also wants people to invest here. He wants the taxpayers to remain here. So, there are responses. Look, having said all that, and I need to put my cards on the table. I agree with the Anthea Jeffrey distillation of that bill. I do not agree with all these commentators who say, actually it's not as bad. It is very bad, that bill. It doesn't just affect your home, it doesn't affect rural land, it affects everything. Because property is not confined to land. That is the key in the current Section 25, and that part isn't being amended. If they said we're going to now have expropriation and compensation confined to rural South Africa, that would be another thing. But they've said everything. I don't think they're going to do it in a radical way, but you're right. Venezuela is an option, and it's as I deal with it, it's a pretty disastrous option.
Right. Whose hands am I missing?
Don't they want to eat and go have coffee? I don't want to bore everyone.
I have a question over there. I'll take that one and then one more. Did I see a hand over here, I thought? No?
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that talk, Bob. Tony, I haven't read your book. Am I still allowed to ask a question?
Yeah, of course you can ask a question, but the answer's between its covers, yes. No,
it is a press.
Please go ahead.
It is a press club, so one is allowed to ask difficult questions. But how do you think you were chairman of the DA, leader of the DA? How do you think the current DA are doing in the light of the current situation? And also, what do you think of the role of Mrs. Ziller in the current situation? So
I think I'll take the Fifth Amendment.
That's a question for dessert. Thank you.
I'll take the Fifth Amendment. No. Listen. I've got 2 chapters on the DA and what went wrong and what I do think about some aspects of Helen's leadership. She had something to say in mind, some of it's good, some of it's not so good. And I do have regard for John Steenhuisen. I don't put in the book, it was 125, that I'm actually the godfather of his youngest daughter, so I better put my cards on the table. But I don't, on the one hand, part of me, I absolutely want the DA to succeed. And I'm not saying that having spent most of my adult life in that organisation. Because without the success of the principal opposition party, you don't have a democratic success. So it's not just because of my affiliations. On the other hand, I am, because of those years and the stripes I've still got on my back, I'm entitled to be critical at times. And I think the DA, like any organisation, has made some big mistakes. I hope they rectify them. And they've got limited time, because I always knew when I was a leader that there was an external auditor. It was called the IEC, and they posted their results on the elections board, and if ever we went backwards, I knew I'd have to go. And the same applies to John. I mean, he's got to actually take the party forward. That's the leader's job. And you saw, however fairly or unfairly or justly, Musi Maimane was dealt with by that committee I was part of. He took the party back. And that was if he hadn't done that, I don't think it would have been a panel inquiry, I don't think he would have left. So there is, you know, the DA correctly holds itself to a high standard of accountability in the ANC. So you're going to see what happens in these local elections, and that's a pretty acid test for the party and its leadership. You know, I respect Helen very much. I'm not sure, well, I certainly wouldn't go back into a leadership position having been the leader, but, you know, she was affirmed in that role last year by a hefty majority of her party congress, so she didn't impose herself. And how that works out, well, there's been, you know, some evidence of how that's working out, and what the voters think, I can't say. But I do hope the DA succeeds, because it is, however imperfect they are, and they are flawed and imperfect, they're peopled and populated by human beings, it really is necessary. And, you know, we're going off tomorrow to Johannesburg to launch my books. You know, it's like going through an obstacle course, Joburg, now, and I lived there with great pleasure and delight for 25 years, because most of the roads are potholes, so that we can say a lot about the Cape Town City Council. Don't worry, I'm their critic in chief. But at least they more or less repair the roads here from time to time, and they don't steal the money, which it doesn't sound like much in South Africa. They're the biggest of big deals. So, you know, we've got to hope that that continues.
And then the last question, sorry, just a silhouette there, I can't see.
Hello, Mr. Leon. I was thinking from happening media, that's our camera right there.
Right.
And so you can just wave there.
Hello.
Looking good, looking good. So, Mr. Leon, I just wanted to ask you, actually expand on the previous question that was asked to you. John Steenhuisen previously mentioned that you are obviously the birth father, Genesis 1, chapter 1, and then Helen Zille was chapter 2. Musi Miamane was Exodus, and then now obviously John is there. I wanted to ask you, when you birthed the DA, compared to now, that's my first question. How do you see the DA in the future, as obviously as a party for more diverse people in South Africa? And then my second question would be, I've got a lot of followers that also mention that, and obviously a lot of youngsters as well, for the future of the DA, that they claim that the DA is a smaller version of the ANC, because it tends to go more socialistic viewpoints and so on. What would your answer be to those youngsters that say that? Thank you.
Yeah, well, very good questions. Let me say, first off, you know, what John Steenhuisen has avoided at all costs of being the author of the book of Jeremiah. So it becomes just a long lamentation of things that go wrong. So I hope he doesn't write the book of Jeremiah, and I have every confidence that he won't. I think the challenges for the DA are very acute, but they've always been very difficult. You know, it's not that this is something new. In fact, in the book, I deal with the fact that the DA has been grappling with issues of identity, issues of voter reach. I reminisced to someone the other day that when I became the leader of the DP, a very small party, we looked like a combination of the Rand Club and the Broederbond, because we didn't look like South Africa. We looked like a tiny version or small version of one corner of South Africa. And we set out, you know, with much gusto to change that dynamic. And I think a lot of mistakes were made on that, but it wasn't done from a bad faith. It was done with the best of intentions, to broaden the reach, to widen the appeal, to extend the hope that an opposition could challenge for power in this country. Hope that's yet to be realized at a national level. And I think what happened last time in the local elections was a misreading of the tea leaves. So the DA did remarkably well to oust, with others, the ANC from all these strongholds in Joburg, in Pretoria, in Nelson Mandela Bay, and win 2/3 of the votes in Cape Town. But they made a fundamental mistake. They thought, well, hang on, we're now knocking on the door of the union buildings. So all we have to do is abandon a few more principles, kiss goodbye existing voters, and then we'll be in power, part of the new power. Well, of course, it all went belly up in the 2019 election. One thing about politics, you can never take your voters for granted. You know, Rolf Meyer, when he was Secretary General of the National Party, turned around, and he's a nice chap, Rolf. He turned around to me in 1997, just before the National Party lost their first by-election ever to the DP in Kempton Park, previously an NP stronghold. And he said, Tony, he said, you know, my voters have nowhere else to go. Terrible remark for a politician to make. Voters have always got choices, what democracy is about, and 450,000 DA voters found they had somewhere else to go in the last election. And that can happen again, and it can multiply, and as I wrote in that report, I said a short-term setback can become a long-term rout if you don't make corrective action. To answer the second part of your question to young people, I think the DA is trying very hard. I mean, I saw they were Stellenbosch the other day. They weren't insulting Afrikaans speakers. They were trying to say it's actually not a crime that you speak Afrikaans at a traditionally Afrikaans university, as I understood Leon Schreiber there. And I think they're doing a lot of things, not that are wrong or pandering, but to emphasize the fact that as a democratic party founded on liberal constitutional principles, everyone has equal rights in this country and there's no preferred group, one above the other. If they keep doing that, if they can make a compelling offer, then, and they can indicate to people how jobs and economic growth will come through the application of policy, junking corruption, then I think they have a real chance. The final point I make about the DA, and I couldn't understand all this anxiety and everyone getting so crivelrich, as we used to say, when Steenhuisen makes the, I thought, the utterly obvious point, well, if push came to shove and there was a split in the ANC, or we would align with the Ramaphosa-led faction, not with the Makashule or Didi Mabuza faction. Well, I said, hello, you know, most sentient human beings in this country would endorse that. And about 100% of your voters and donors would. If I took a vote here and said, oh, you know, who do you support? Ramaphosa or Makashule? You might get 1 or 2 votes for Ramaphosa. The truth of the matter is, suddenly the next day they were up in arms in the DA and they were running off to the press ombudsman. I didn't understand it. You know, in politics, you've got to have self-confidence and back yourself. And my message to my dear friends in the party is back yourselves. Go and make your case, and do so with certainty and with conviction. Thanks.
Thank you very much.